Cardiff, November 2003. The final rally of the season has just finished. The service park is doing what service parks do at the end of a championship year, winding down, packing up. The particular exhaustion of a campaign that has been running since January finally allowed to show itself. Mechanics who have spent 11 months living inside vans and hotels and the fluorescent light of tire storage areas are loading equipment they won't touch again until February. Richard Burns has just completed the last competitive drive of his life. Nobody in that service park knows that yet. Burns may have suspected it. He had been experiencing symptoms for weeks, headaches, something not quite right in the way his body was responding, and he had kept driving. The season had a finish line. He would reach it. That was how he did everything. The medical appointment that would change the rest of his life was days away. What the doctors found was a brain tumor, glioblastoma multiforme, one of the most aggressive forms of brain cancer that exists. The median survival time after diagnosis is 12 to 15 months. Richard Burns had just turned 32. This is not a story about a driver who died young, though that is part of it. It is a story about a specific kind of mind, methodical, precise, built for the long game, and what that mind achieved in a sport that was never quite sure what to do with someone like him. It is about what he won, how he won it, and what it cost to keep going when he already knew something was wrong. It is about the driver nobody watched, who beat everyone who was watching.
If this is the kind of story you want more of, the version behind the version, the history that didn't make the podium ceremony, subscribe. This is what we cover. Burns came through British rallying in the early 1990s, part of a generation that would go on to define what the World Rally Championship looked like for a decade. Colin McRae was already the one everyone talked about. Spectacular, instinctive, committed to a style of driving that treated the laws of physics as a negotiating position rather than a constraint. McRae on a stage was an event. You watched him the way you watch something that might go wrong, not because you wanted it to, but because the possibility was always present, and the possibility was part of what made it beautiful. Burns was the one the engineers talked about. His approach to pace notes, the verbal instructions a co-driver reads aloud to guide a driver through a stage they cannot fully see, was unlike most of his contemporaries. Where other drivers treated notes as shorthand, as a compressed language to be interpreted at speed through instinct and feel, Burns treated them as a technical document, something to be authored with precision, tested against the road surface, revised. He and his co-driver, Robert Reed, developed a system together that was unusually granular, specific about gradient changes, surface transitions, the way a corner tightened or opened across its full length rather than just at its entry point. He walked stages when the regulations permitted it, not strolled, walked with purpose, gathering information the way an engineer gathers data before a test. He wanted to know what the road actually was, not what it looked like from inside the car at speed. The question this raised, in the paddock, in press coverage, in the way his career was framed against McRae's, was whether this approach was caution dressed up as method, whether Burns was a driver who had found an intellectual framework to justify not quite having what the fastest drivers had. The 2001 World Rally Championship answered that question. It answered it in the most complete way possible, and it did so in a way that was entirely consistent with everything Burns had been doing for the previous decade. He won by knowing more than everyone else at every moment on every stage.
Burns drove for Mitsubishi from 1993, working his way through the junior structures of the WRC, while McRae was already winning championships with Subaru and becoming the sport's dominant commercial personality. By the time Burns moved to Subaru in 1999, the dynamic between them was established. McRae was the poster, Burns was the points finisher. McRae was the driver sponsors wanted in their advertisements. Burns was the driver engineers wanted debriefing the car on a Monday morning after a rally that had produced data worth understanding. Neither characterization was entirely fair to either of them, but the sport has always needed a story, and the story it told about Burns was that he was the careful one, the methodical one, the one who finished when others didn't. What that story missed was that finishing when others didn't is not a passive achievement. It is not caution. It is the result of reading a stage differently from your rivals, managing a car to a degree of precision that allows it to still be running on the final day when cars that have been driven at their absolute limit are not. The difference between Burns and McRae was not nerve, it was information management. Burns simply knew at every moment of a rally more about what his car could and couldn't sustain than almost any driver on the circuit. The 2001 season made this visible in a way that was impossible to explain away. Burns accumulated points, not through luck, not through rivals' misfortune alone, though misfortune played its part, as it always does, but through a consistency of performance that the championship format was designed to reward and that the sports culture had never quite decided to celebrate. He won rallies. He finished rallies he didn't win. He arrived at the final round, Rally GB, his home rally, the rally he had won 4 times, with a points lead that reduced the mathematics to a single scenario. McRae needed to win Rally GB, and Burns needed to fail. McRae crashed out. Burns was confirmed World Rally Champion in Wales on the roads he knew better than any in the world, in a rally that had given him more than any other stage in his career. The crowd gave him something that went beyond the noise a crowd makes for a winner. It was recognition, not just of the result, of the method, of a decade of working towards something in a way that the cameras had never quite been able to frame. He had always said he would win it eventually. He had never said he would win it like this, but when it happened, it looked exactly like him.
Burns was not built for the performance of triumph. Some drivers are. Some drivers have the capacity to exist fully inside a championship moment, to fill it, to become the image that the cameras are looking for, to give the sport the spectacle it needs when the result is decided. McRae had it. It wasn't manufactured. It was genuine. He felt things loudly, and the cameras found him. Burns felt things precisely. His post-championship interviews from Rally GB 2001 are quiet in a way that still reads as slightly unusual. He is happy, clearly, genuinely happy. He says the right things. He thanks Robert Reed, whose contribution to the title was real and documented and acknowledged by Burns with a specificity that was characteristic. He does not perform. He does not reach for the grand statement. He speaks about the work, about what it took, about what the system he and Reed had built over years had finally produced. Robert Reed, for his part, has spoken in the years since about what Burns was like to work with, the rigor, the patience, the absolute refusal to accept imprecision in the preparation. The relationship between a driver and co-driver in rally is unlike almost any other in motorsport. You are in the same car, absorbing the same forces, dependent on the same information, and the trust required is total. Reed has described Burns as someone who treated that relationship as a professional obligation of the highest order. Not cold, precise. There is a difference. What the 2001 championship gave Burns was confirmation, not of his talent. He had always known what he was capable of. Confirmation that the way he had chosen to do it was right, that the long game, played carefully and without deviation, could produce the same result as the spectacular one. He was 30 years old, he had the world title, he had a method that worked and a co-driver who understood it completely. He had, by any reasonable measure, more championships ahead of him. Burns moved to Peugeot for 2003. The season was competitive. Peugeot had machinery capable of winning. Burns was in his second year with the team, working through the process of understanding a new car with the same systematic approach he had applied to everything else in his career. He did not win the championship that year. The season produced results, produced learning, produced the kind of incremental progress that his career had always been built on. What we know now, and what the timeline makes unavoidable,
is that somewhere inside that 2003 season, the tumor was already there. The precise moment when symptoms began is not fully documented. What has been reported, and it is reported rather than confirmed, because Burns was not someone who spoke publicly about physical vulnerability while he was still competing, is that he was managing something in the latter part of the season, headaches, a sense of something not quite responding the way it should, the kind of thing a driver with his tolerance for discomfort and his commitment to finishing a task would manage quietly, would note and set aside, would deal with when the season was done. He drove the final round. He completed Rally GB. He finished the year. Then he stopped. The medical appointment that followed produced a diagnosis that reframed everything, not just what came next, but what had already happened. The final months of his last competitive season now exist in a particular light. He was doing what he had always done, gathering information, managing what he could manage, reaching the finish line on discipline when other resources were running low. He just didn't know, yet, what the finish line actually was.
Glioblastoma multiforme does not negotiate. It is fast-growing, aggressive, and resistant to the treatments available in 2003. The surgery Burns underwent in early 2004 was aimed at extending his options, not resolving the problem. Median survival after diagnosis is 12 to 15 months. The statistics are not kind, and they do not have many exceptions. Burns survived 24 months. In the period between diagnosis and death, he spoke publicly about wanting to return to competition. There were reports, reported rather than confirmed, of testing, of simulator work, of conversations with teams about the possibility of a comeback if his condition stabilized. Whether these were serious operational discussions or the sport's way of keeping hope visible is not fully documented. What is documented is that Burns did not stop thinking about it. The idea of returning was not a comfort he used in interviews. It appears to have been a genuine intention, held for as long as it was physically possible to hold it. He attended the 2005 Rally GB as a spectator. The crowd at Rally GB knew what they were looking at. They gave him a reception that had nothing to do with the competitive result of that weekend and everything to do with what he had given the sport and what the sport was watching happen to him. He stood and received it with the same composure he had brought to everything else. Richard Burns died on the 25th of November 2005. He was 34 years old. The 2001 Rally GB, where he was confirmed world champion, concluded in the final days of November 2001. The symmetry between those two dates, 4 years apart, is the kind of detail that feels like it was arranged by something with a sense of narrative. It wasn't. It is simply what happened. He was diagnosed immediately after the last rally he would ever drive. He died in the same week of the year that he had won everything.
The Richard Burns Foundation was established in his name to support young rally drivers coming through the British system, the same system that produced him, the same junior structures he had worked through in the early 1990s with a precision and patience that the sport had not quite known what to do with at the time. Robert Reed has spoken about him carefully and consistently in the years since. The care is visible. So is the precision. Reed speaks about Burns the way Burns prepared pace notes. Nothing approximate, nothing that doesn't belong. What Burns left the sport is harder to quantify than a championship or a foundation or a lap time. He left a demonstration that the considered approach, the one that doesn't make the highlight reel, the one that gathers information when it could be gathering speed, the one that treats every stage as a technical problem to be solved rather than a spectacle to be produced, can produce the same result as any other approach, can produce the world title, can produce the standing ovation at the end of the career. He operated in the era of McRae, in the era of the sideways moment, in a sport that had decided what a champion was supposed to look like. He won anyway. He won by being exactly what he was, which is the hardest way to win anything. The one variable he couldn't model in advance, couldn't walk the stage to check, couldn't build into the pace notes, was the one that ended it. He drove through it for as long as he could. Then he stopped.